It was close to midnight in Manhattan, and the city had that strange stillness that comes only after the day's chaos fades. The skyline shimmered in cold steel and amber light, and inside the top floor of Mitchell Enterprises, Grant Mitchell sat behind a massive glass desk, his focus buried in numbers and projections. The soft hum of the city below was his only company as he reviewed the merger deal that had consumed his every waking hour for the past month. His phone buzzed once, then again. He glanced at the screen, expecting another late-night message from one of his executives, but it wasn't a familiar name. It was a number he didn't recognize, a hospital number. For a moment, he hesitated. Unknown numbers at this hour usually meant problems, and Grant was the kind of man who avoided personal interruptions. Still, something made him reach for the phone. The voice on the other end was calm but urgent. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Manhattan General Hospital. We have an Emma Caldwell here. You're listed as her emergency contact." Grant froze, unsure he had heard correctly. Emma Caldwell as executive assistant, the woman who had kept his schedule running with clockwork precision, who handled his meetings, travel, and most of his sanity, had listed him as her emergency contact. He sat up straighter. "What happened?" he asked quickly. The nurse explained that Emma had collapsed in her apartment and had been rushed to the emergency ward. There were no other contacts listed. Grant felt an unfamiliar sensation, a heavy weight in his chest that had nothing to do with business. Without a second thought, he grabbed his coat and left the office. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing traffic lights and unanswered questions. How could Emma have collapsed? She'd been working late just 2 days ago, coordinating logistics for an investor dinner. She'd looked tired, yes, but he had assumed it was the usual exhaustion that came with the job. When he arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the low murmur of voices pulled him into a world far removed from the polished glass towers he was used to. He found the nurse who had called him, and she led him to the waiting area outside the emergency room. Grant had faced corporate crises worth billions, but now, as he waited for the doctor, he found himself tapping his foot restlessly, trying to control the growing unease inside him. When the doctor finally approached, Grant stood immediately. The physician's expression was grave but professional. "Mr. Mitchell, Miss Caldwell is stable for now, but she's been under significant stress. There are signs of severe fatigue and malnutrition. We'll need to run more tests, but it appears this wasn't a one-time collapse." Grant felt a chill pass through him. "Is she going to be all right?" he asked quietly. The doctor nodded slowly. "We'll know more by morning. For now, she's resting. She'll need support, emotionally and physically." Grant thanked him and asked if he could see her. The doctor hesitated for a moment, then agreed. When he stepped into the dimly lit hospital room, the sight before him was something he didn't expect. Emma lay asleep, pale and fragile against the white sheets. The strong, efficient woman he'd relied on for years looked impossibly small and breakable. Her hair was tied back loosely, her breathing shallow. For a man known for his unshakable composure, Grant felt something he hadn't in years, a guilt. He thought of the countless times he dismissed her quiet "I'm fine" as professionalism, the subtle signs of exhaustion he'd ignored, the weekends she had stayed behind when everyone else had gone home. He realized that somewhere between his pursuit of perfection and his obsession with control, he had missed the simple truth that Emma was human, not a machine built to serve his success. He sat in the chair beside her bed, the sound of the heart monitor marking the seconds that felt heavier with each passing beat. His thoughts began to drift back to their first meeting. Emma had joined Mitchell Enterprises straight out of graduate school, overqualified, sharp, and endlessly dedicated. She had impressed him in the first week by organizing his chaotic calendar and rescuing a $1 million presentation from disaster. She had been dependable, uncomplaining, and professional to the core. He had admired her efficiency but had never stopped to notice her humanity. Now, watching her lying there, he wondered how much she had sacrificed to keep his empire running. The nurse returned quietly to check on her for a line. "She's been pushing herself too hard," the nurse said softly, almost to herself. "She told us she's been feeling dizzy for weeks but didn't want to miss work." Grant didn't respond. He only nodded slightly, his eyes fixed on Emma. The nurse looked at him for a moment, as if trying to understand his relationship to this woman. Then she added, You must be someone important to her. You're the only person she listed to call. The words hit him harder than he expected. For a man surrounded by hundreds of employees, board members, and associates, Grant realized how profoundly alone Emma must have been. He stayed there through the night, the rhythmic beeping of the machines mixing with the distant hum of the hospital corridors. Every now and then, he would glance at her and wonder what kind of life she led outside of work, if she had friends, family, anyone who noticed when she didn't show up. He thought of how she never spoke much about herself, how she always redirected conversations back to work. He had mistaken that silence for professionalism when it was really a kind of loneliness. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who commanded thousands couldn't remember the last time he had asked someone if they were okay. When dawn broke and the first light filtered through the blinds, Emma stirred slightly. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then widened when she saw him sitting there. "Mr. Mitchell?" she murmured, her voice weak. He leaned forward. "Hey, take it easy," he said, trying to sound calm. She blinked, trying to process his presence. "You didn't have to call me a broken bar," she said softly. He shook his head. "Of course I did." For a moment, she looked confused, as if she couldn't decide whether to believe him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Her words stung. "Ma," he said firmly, "you didn't cause trouble. You scared me. That's what you did." She gave a faint, tired smile. "That's new. I didn't think anything scared you." He didn't know how to respond. The silence stretched between them, full of things unsaid, years of small kindnesses overlooked, loyalty taken for granted, effort unacknowledged. When a nurse entered to adjust her medication, he stood and stepped aside, watching as Emma drifted back to sleep. And in that quiet moment, Grant Mitchell, the man who had built his life around control and success, realized that the most important call of his life hadn't come from a business partner or an investor. It had come from a hospital, asking for someone who had no one else. That night had changed something in him. As he looked at her one last time before leaving the room, Grant knew that he could no longer go back to the person he had been just hours earlier. The deal waiting on his desk, the meetings scheduled for the morning, the numbers that once defined his worth, all of it suddenly seemed small. He walked out of the hospital into the quiet gray light of morning, the city just beginning to wake. For the first time in years, Grant Mitchell didn't think about profit or deadlines. He thought only of the woman who had always been there, silently holding up his world, and how he had almost missed the call that might have saved her life and his own humanity. When Emma woke the next morning, the sterile brightness of the hospital room pressed against her eyes, and the faint scent of disinfectant lingered in the air. It took her a moment to remember where she was. Her head felt heavy, and her body ached in that dull, unfamiliar way that followed deep exhaustion. As her eyes adjusted, she saw the tray of untouched food beside her bed and the sunlight spilling through the half-drawn curtains. Then her gaze fell on the chair in the corner. Grant Mitchell sat there, his usually crisp suit wrinkled, his tie loosened, and a faint shadow of fatigue marking his face. It was clear he hadn't left. For a moment, she wondered if she was dreaming of the idea of her boss, the powerful and intimidating Grant Mitchell, sitting quietly by her bedside, felt impossible. He noticed her stirring and straightened slightly, meeting her gaze. There was something different in his expression, something unguarded. "You're awake," he said softly, his voice low, almost careful. She tried to sit up, but he moved quickly to adjust the bed controls for her. "Don't strain yourself," he added. "The doctor said you need rest." She offered a faint, embarrassed smile. "You didn't have to stay," she murmured. "I didn't want to be in the way." His reply came without hesitation. "You weren't in the way, Ma. You scared everyone yesterday." He paused, realizing how untrue that sounded. It wasn't everyone, it was him. She had scared him. The awkward silence that followed was filled with quiet beeps from the heart monitor and the distant murmur of nurses in the hallway. Emma looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the edge of the hospital blanket. "I'm sorry," she said again. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I guess I've just been a broken bar." "Tired?" Grant leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. "Tired?" he repeated, his tone soft but edged with concern. "The doctor said you've been overworking yourself, that you haven't been eating properly." "Why didn't you say anything?" She hesitated, her throat tightening. "It's not really something I could complain about," she said quietly. "Everyone works hard. I just didn't want to fall behind or seem unprofessional." Her words struck him harder than he expected. Grant had spent his entire career pushing people and himself to their limits. Efficiency, discipline, and results were his holy trinity. But now, hearing those same values echo back at him through her strained voice, they sounded cruel. He realized she had mirrored his own expectations too perfectly. "Ma," he said, leaning closer, "you've never been behind. You've been holding everything together, even when I didn't notice." "That's not unprofessional. That's a broken bar too much." The admission surprised even him. He wasn't used to confessing fault, but seeing the faint tear trace down her cheek broke something in him, a wall he hadn't known existed. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed. "You don't have to say that," she whispered. "I know I'm replaceable." "Everyone is." Grant sat back slowly, studying her. "Replaceable?" he repeated, almost to himself. The word lingered, bitter and hollow. "You think you're replaceable?" She nodded weakly, not looking at him. "In work, yes, that's how it goes. People come and go. You keep going because you have to." Her tone was matter-of-fact, but he could hear the fatigue buried beneath it. For a moment, Grant said nothing. His gaze drifted to the window, where morning light shimmered faintly on the glass. It was strange, he thought, how easily people disappeared in the world he'd built. Employees came and went, names fading from his mind as quickly as they appeared on the payroll. But Emma had been different. He couldn't recall a day in the past 5 years when she hadn't been at the center of his schedule, anticipating his needs, fixing problems before they happened, keeping chaos at bay. And yet, he had never stopped to wonder who kept her steady when everything fell apart. "I've been a terrible boss," he said finally. Emma blinked in surprise. The admission was so uncharacteristic that for a moment she wasn't sure she'd heard him correctly. "You haven't," she said quickly, instinctively defending him. "You've just a broken bar being busy." But Grant shook his head. That's not it. I've been blind. I didn't see how much I was asking from you. How much you were giving." He paused, his voice lowering. "I should have noticed sooner." Her eyes softened, though her exhaustion was still visible. "You couldn't have known," she said. "I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to seem weak." That word weak hit him like a punch. He thought of how often he had praised strength, focus, and endurance in his employees, never realizing that the people who tried hardest to live up to those ideals were the ones quietly breaking under them. A nurse entered briefly to check her vitals and smiled faintly at the sight of him still there. When she left, the silence settled again, not uncomfortable, but thick with reflection. "Ma," Grant said after a moment, "what do you want to do when you leave here?" She looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he continued, "beyond work, beyond everything else, what do you actually want?" It was a question she hadn't been asked in years. She frowned slightly, as though trying to remember an answer she once knew. "A broken bar, don't really know anymore," she admitted softly. "I used to want to travel, maybe study something creative, but life doesn't always go that way." Grant studied her expression, realizing just how much of herself she had buried beneath responsibility. "Then maybe," he said carefully, "it's time you get some of that life back." She laughed weakly, though there was no mockery in it. "And how am I supposed to do that?" "Quit," he hesitated before replying. "Take time, rest. The company will manage without you for a while." She raised an eyebrow, half amused, half skeptical. "You really think it will?" "If it doesn't," he said quietly, "then maybe I've been running it wrong." The honesty in his voice startled her. Grant Mitchell, the man who was always composed, always calculating, sounded human, almost remorseful. She wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that she'd made her own choices, but the truth hung between them, unspoken. Her exhaustion hadn't been just personal, it had been systemic, the product of a world where success was everything and people became tools in its pursuit. Hours later, when she dozed off again, Grant remained seated, lost in thought. He looked around the room at the quiet beeping machines, the soft light playing across her face, and something shifted in him. For the first time in years, he thought about what mattered beyond numbers and performance charts. He thought about the faces behind the emails, the people whose unseen efforts built his empire. And he realized how fragile it all was, how easily a system could consume the very souls that sustained it. Before leaving, he walked to the nurse's station and left his card. "If she needs anything," he said, "call me directly anytime." The nurse nodded politely, but he could tell she recognized the weight behind his tone. As he stepped outside, the morning air felt cold against his skin, yet oddly refreshing. The city was already awake, bustling with people racing toward their own deadlines, their own quiet battles. Grant stood there for a long moment, watching the movement, the rhythm of life he had always been part of but never really seen. He thought of Emma as the quiet, steady force behind so many of his successes, and how close he had come to losing her without ever realizing what she meant. For once, he didn't feel like rushing to the office. He didn't reach for his phone or think about meetings. Instead, he found himself walking aimlessly, letting the noise of the city fade into something softer, almost human. He knew that when Emma returned, things had to change, not just for her, but for everyone. Because if one person could break under the weight of success, it meant the system itself was broken. And for the first time in his career, Grant Mitchell decided that fixing it mattered more than profits. When Emma finally returned to work 3 weeks later, the building felt different, quieter, more aware somehow. The whispers of keyboards and the muted buzz of phones filled the air as usual, but there was a subtle change in rhythm, as though something invisible had shifted since she'd last been there. She walked through the glass doors of Mitchell Enterprises with hesitant steps, her mind caught between relief and anxiety. She had insisted she was ready, though deep down she knew she wasn't the same woman who had collapsed in her apartment. Her body still tired easily, and her mind carried the strange calm that came only after one has faced the edges of themselves and stepped back. When she reached her floor, a few co-workers greeted her with cautious smiles. There was genuine concern in their eyes, something she wasn't used to seeing before. She smiled politely, trying not to feel self-conscious. For the first time in years, she was wearing a simple dress instead of her usual sharp business attire. She felt lighter but also exposed. She took a slow breath and walked toward her office, but before she could sit down, her phone rang. Grant Mitchell's name appeared on the screen. "Ma," his voice came through, calm and deliberate. "You're in?" "Yes," she said, trying to sound steady. "Good. Come up to my office when you're ready. No rush." No rush. The phrase surprised her. Grant had never said those words before. She straightened her posture and gathered herself before walking to the top floor. The elevator ride felt longer than usual, every second echoing the weight of unspoken questions. What had changed, what he expected, and whether he would see her differently now. When the elevator doors opened, Grant was standing by the window, hands in his pockets. The skyline stretched behind him like a painting. The city shimmered beneath the pale winter light. He turned when she entered, offering a faint but genuine smile. "It's good to see you, Ma," he said. She nodded, returning the smile. "It's good to be back." He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. She sat, noticing that the usual pile of paperwork was missing. The space looked at a broken bar letter, almost minimalist. "How are you feeling?" he asked, and she could tell from his tone that he wasn't asking out of formality. She hesitated, then replied honestly. "Better. A little tired, but better." He nodded thoughtfully, as if weighing the words. "Good. That's what matters." They sat in silence for a moment, an unfamiliar stillness settling between them. Emma finally broke it with a quiet laugh. "It feels strange being asked how I am in this office." Grant smiled, almost sheepishly. "I know. I should have asked that a long time ago." There was a pause, then he leaned forward slightly, his tone shifting from gentle to serious. "Ma, I owe you an apology. I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few weeks about how we run this place, about how I've been running it. You've been carrying far more than anyone should." "That's on me." Her instinct was to brush it off, to protect him from guilt. "You don't have to apologize. I should have taken better care of myself." He shook his head firmly. "No, Ma, you shouldn't have had to. The culture I built rewarded silence and exhaustion. It punished vulnerability. That's not leadership, that's blindness." His honesty startled her. The man who once measured every word like a transaction was now speaking like someone unlearning everything he'd believed. She didn't know what to say. so she stayed quiet, watching him with a mixture of respect and disbelief. Grant continued, "I've made some changes since you left. We've introduced flexible hours. People can take mental health days without needing an excuse. I've even hired an extra assistant for your team." Emma blinked, surprised. "That's a broken bar, unexpected." He smiled faintly. "You mean uncharacteristic?" She laughed softly. "Something like that." He leaned back in his chair, looking out the window. "You made me realize something, Emma. For years, I thought success meant control, precision, perfection, always pushing harder. But it isn't. Success means people. It means care. And somehow, I forgot that." The sincerity in his words made her chest tighten. She could see that the man before her wasn't just a powerful executive anymore. He was human in a way he'd never allowed himself to be. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll help me fix it," he replied. She looked at him, unsure if he was serious. "You want my help?" "I need it," he said simply. "You see this place more clearly than anyone. You know what it's like to keep it moving, even when no one notices." For a moment, she couldn't speak. Years of invisible effort, of staying later and being overlooked, suddenly felt acknowledged. Not as duty but as value. "I'll help," she said finally, her voice steady. "But only if you promise to keep your word." He extended a hand. "I promise." Their handshake lingered a little too long, not out of formality, but respect. Maybe something deeper neither dared to name. Over the next few weeks, Emma began to see the transformation unfold. Small changes at first, meetings that started later to allow rest, open conversations about stress, quiet corners turned into break spaces. The air in the office felt lighter, and people began to smile more. Grant, for his part, seemed different too. He no longer rushed through the halls or barked to orders. He listened, really listened, to his employees. Some didn't trust the change at first, assuming it was temporary, but gradually, they began to believe it. Emma watched him from a quiet distance, noticing how he made an effort to connect, not with authority, but with empathy. There were moments when their eyes met across the conference table, brief and unspoken, but heavy with understanding. And yet, despite the progress, Emma sometimes found herself haunted by old habits, the urge to overwork, to prove her worth. But each time she felt the familiar pressure rising, she would hear his words echoing in her mind. "You shouldn't have had to." Those words had become her quiet anchor, a reminder that she wasn't alone in the weight anymore. One evening, long after the others had gone home, Grant passed her office and noticed her still working. He tapped on the doorframe gently. "Old habits," she smiled faintly, closing her laptop. "Trying to finish up before tomorrow." He stepped inside. "You know, you're allowed to leave things unfinished sometimes." "Not everything," she said softly. He nodded. "Maybe not, but some things can wait." Their eyes met again, and for a moment, the silence felt heavy with something unsaid, gratitude, maybe something deeper that neither dared voice. When she finally left that night, walking into the crisp city air, she felt lighter than she had in years. The world outside shimmered with life, people rushing through the streets with umbrellas and laughter. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was falling behind. She was simply part of it, alive, whole, present. Grant watched her from his window, her silhouette fading into the glow of the city lights. He didn't know what the future would hold, for the company, for himself, or for her, but he knew this much: the night he got that call had changed everything. It had stripped away the illusion of power and success, leaving behind something real, something human. In the end, the empire he'd built wasn't defined by numbers or achievements. It was defined by people like Emma, the ones who gave quietly, who held the world together without asking for recognition. And as he turned off the lights and closed his office door, Grant Mitchell understood something he never had before. The greatest victories are not measured in profit or prestige but in compassion, in the simple, often unnoticed act of caring for another person before it's too late.